ladies and gentlemen, to the Hoover Presidential Library-Museum. My name is Tom Schwartz, I'm the director. And we're very pleased this afternoon to have Paul Fell, a well-known editorial cartoonist who is here. I'll just turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for being invited to the Herbert Hoover Library to speak during the Ding Darling exhibit. As a longtime editorial cartoonist, I am in awe of people like Ding Darling. They were the giants in our profession, the superstars, the mega gods, if you will. And any opportunity I get to see original art by some of those superstars like Ding Darling or Billy Ireland or Roland Kirby or any of those wonderful cartoonists that drew during the early 1900s and 30s and 40s. And it's just astounding to me. I'd also like to thank Dr. Tom Schwartz for inviting me to speak too. I think it was a process of elimination. There aren't too many of us left in the business. But that's okay, you know, as long as you show up for the meal, it works just fine. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ding Darling's work today and kind of draw some parallels between how he worked and how I work, and I'll also talk a little bit about the state of editorial cartooning today compared to what it was like when I first broke into the business in the 70s. And then I'll open the floor to questions if you have any. Two questions I will not answer. Do not ask me how old I am, and do not ask me how much money I make. I don't want your pity. Well, let's look at some slides here. I have several thousand. No, not really. The reason I show this slide is I did this cartoon years and years ago, but it still holds true today. You know, I have a background in fine arts. I've got 2 bachelor's degrees in visual arts, and I have a master's degree in painting. And I've been a high school art teacher and a college art professor. And you know, when I tell people that I draw cartoons, they will either ask later, what do you really do? Or they ask, do you do any serious art? I say, well, no, not really. I don't do anything like sunsets and flowers. I just do, you know, cartoons about frivolous subjects like corruption and war and hunger and genocide and, you know, that kind of silly stuff. So that's kind of why I have the cartoon there. Also, cartoonist out of work will draw for food. Just a plea for help. I actually got exposed to the work of Ding Darling the first time I ever saw. I'd seen his work in print over the years, but the first time I saw a Ding Darling original was in the early 80s at a conference at Ohio State University. I was blown away by how big his stuff is. I mean, go in and look at that exhibit. Those cartoons are enormous. I mean, they're roughly, you know, 20 inches tall and 15 inches wide, maybe even a little bit bigger if you just measure the paper. My work is on 11 by 14 paper, and the cartoon itself measures 8 by 10. And I know some people that work smaller. And just to see the scope of his work is amazing, but newspapers were bigger in those days and they ran the cartoons a lot bigger. This is one of the examples of color cartoons that I saw. I think that's good old Woodrow Wilson in the background. And you know, he's dealing with the Mexican outlaw government, which isn't much different than today in a lot of cases. But it was colored in watercolor. And newspapers didn't run much in the way of color because it was very difficult to do and it was very expensive to do. Now with the advent of computers, every newspaper has color. I don't know if you guys remember back in the, was it early 80s, mid 80s when USA Today came out, and with all their color and their charts and their graphs, and people in the business were calling them McNewspaper. And within 3 years, everybody had charts and graphs and color, and now, you know, it's just the norm. At first it was they got color on page 1, and now so many newspapers have color everywhere. It's just many daily newspapers print their comics in color every single day instead of just on Sunday. So it's just the technology has evolved over the years. As I say, some things never change, and this cartoon could stand today as you know, in the scope of current events. Ding Darling drew with a pen very similar to what you see in this cartoon. This is, if you recall, I think some of you are my age. We were in grade school in the 50s, and you had penmanship class, and you had a dip pen. You dipped the pen into the inkwell, and then you wrote with it. Well, I went to Catholic school, so maybe in public school they didn't do that, but at Our Lady of Perpetual Guilt, this is how we learned penmanship. This is what they drew with in those days. A little bit with a brush, but for the most part with pens. The points of those pens, for instance, go in and look at the Darling show and look at the lines that he works up. You will notice those lines vary in thickness, like the beginning of a stroke will be very thin, and then it'll get thick, and then it'll get thin again. That was a pen nib that was very, very flexible. And of course, the more you used it, the more you broke it in. Those are hard to find today. In those days, they were very common. There were no halftones. Like, you know, today we can get all sorts of grays and all sorts of variances in color. In those days, the cartoonist did his shading with lines. This doesn't reproduce very well, but let's see if we can show you another one. Oh, that's not even, I'll go back to this one. But the cartoonist shaded with lines. Parallel lines are called hatching. And to get a darker value or shade, you would run the lines closer together. And if you wanted an even darker layer, you would put a second layer over the first layer. That's called cross-hatching. This was a technique that was used for just, you know, generations. This cartoon has to do with economic recovery. This is one of Ding's great wildlife cartoons. As I say, I'm so close to it here. I think maybe you can see it more clearly than I do, but you can see the first panel is 1920, and the ducks are landing and everything is fine and pristine. And then in 1930, the ducks come in for a landing, and there's about 200 hunters peppering them with buckshot. And then in 1940, we go to the extinct American species exhibit, where the bison and the dodo and the duck are located. So, you know, this was one of Ding's passions. The difference between cartoonists today and cartoonists in, let's just use the 1920s as an example, is that a lot of cartoonists today can't draw. I mean, go look at the variety of styles out there. I think it's great that we have such a wide variety of styles, but some of those people cannot draw to save their butts. I'm sorry. In the old days, they were all wonderful draftsmen. Drawing ability will not make you a great editorial cartoonist. You've got to have something to say first and foremost. But my contention is that if you can't draw, and you're trying to convey this great idea, you're handicapped. It's like telling a joke with a mouthful of crackers. It's, you know, be a much better joke if you just swallowed the crackers. So, you know, you see this variety of styles today, but that's just the way it works in the U.S. If you look at Canadian editorial cartoons, you'll notice that they are all outstanding draftsmen. But we have this wide variety of styles here in the U.S. Every time I start thinking I'm pretty good, I look at the work of people like Ding Darling, and it puts me right back down on earth where I belong. And it tells me I've got a lot to learn. It's kind of like people talk about education, and I remember some old-time professor told me this when I was a freshman in college. He said, The more education you get, the more education you will realize you need. And you start thinking about that. You know, the people that think they're really smart don't have a whole lot of education. The more education we get, the more we realize there's a lot out there to learn. So that's partially why I'm still doing this stuff, you know, 40 years later, is because I know the question people always ask a cartoonist is, what's your best cartoon that you ever did? Hopefully the one I do tomorrow. Because if I've already done my best cartoon, what the heck am I doing? It's like the aging baseball player that can tell you, you know, he hit 50 home runs back in 1992. Well, his career's been on a slide ever since. You know, maybe it's time to get out. I'm always looking for that home run. This is kind of on the left is about the kind of pen that Ding would have used in those days. The panel to the right, I just pulled off the internet. These are pen nibs that you can actually buy today. They're made by the Speedball company. Speedball has made calligraphy pens for, geez, as long as I've been around. When I was in high school, I remember using Speedball pens to do calligraphy. And they use different kinds of drawing pens, some of which have very flexible nibs and some of which are very stiff. I haven't used a drawing pen like this, I think, since I was in high school. There's just so much more in the way of media to use today that I've just kind of gotten completely away from it. This is a shot I pulled off the internet when I was doing this slideshow, and I got to looking at it and I thought, hey, wait a minute, I know who owns those hands. Those hands belong to Jan Elliott, who I know, who does the comic strip Stone Soup, which some of you may see in your local papers. And you can see Jan is inking her strip. And editorial cartoons are done in much a similar way. They're penciled first, and then they're inked. And you notice she's wearing a white glove with the fingers cut off. I don't do that, but I know cartoonists that do, and that's so that the sweat from their hands doesn't, you know, cause the paper to buckle, and it keeps your hand clean so you don't get all that black stuff from your pencil lead on your hand. It also helps your hand kind of glide along the paper when you're inking, which is kind of important. So that's probably pretty much how Ding Darling would have drawn. Only from looking at his work, I don't think Ding drew with little short finger strokes. I remember some of my drawing professors in college would talk to us about, you know, don't draw with your hand, draw with your arm. You know, make big sweeping strokes, be confident when you draw. And I could just see Ding Darling with those huge drawings with that pen going. I don't know how many pens he went through in a week. This is a Farm Aid cartoon. And this one I noticed was hanging in the setup of Ding's studio in the exhibit. And this is obviously colored with watercolor. And again, the reason I included it up there was so that you could see how cartoonists had to do color in those days. It to me, you know, seems to be a much more complicated process. In my day as an art teacher, I've taught pretty much every class that you could teach in art, whether it's watercolor or sculpture or printmaking or drawing. I think watercolor is the hardest thing to do out of all the different disciplines of visual art, because with watercolor it's just as important what you don't do as what you do. I taught at Peru State College in Nebraska for 10 years, and my colleague in the art department had been my mentor when I was undergrad, and he's a wonderful watercolor painter. And he always used to tell his students, make the paper work for you. You know, don't cover up the paper completely. Make that white stuff work for you. Well, that sounds really simple until you try it. Okay, we get to my stuff here. Just by way of giving an idea of where I come from as an editorial cartoonist, I really didn't start out to be an editorial cartoonist. I was the school cartoonist in high school. I used to get in a lot of trouble and get sent to the office. And one day the assistant principal, after threatening me with reform school and God knows what other things, he says, "Fel, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with you. I think I'm going to put you to work on the school magazine." Because I wasn't a troublemaker, but I was the kid in the back of the room drawing instead of paying attention all the time. And so he put me to work on the school magazine. This was a good-sized high school back in Massachusetts. And after a couple of months, he called me into his office again. And I was doing like a cartoon for every issue on what was going on around school, you know, funny things that happened. I was designing the cover for the magazine. I was just doing all kinds of stuff. And he called me into his office and he says, "So," he said, "how's things going with the magazine?" I said, "Okay." He said, "Yeah, you're kind of a celebrity around here now." He said, "Everybody knows you. You're like the cartoonist at the local paper." He said, "You're kind of a star, aren't you?" I said, "Well, yeah." And then he leaned over his desk and he said, "Remember this, I made you a star. In one wrong move, and I'll make you nothing." And I walked out of his office and I thought, "Oh man, now I got to be a model student for the next 2 years." Oh, he had me. When I went to college, actually went to Peru State College in Nebraska. People ask, how's a kid from Massachusetts get to Peru State College? And I tell them Vietnam is one good reason. It was the baby boom, and Vietnam was going on, and there weren't all the community colleges and junior colleges and state colleges back east that there are now. So there were a heck of a lot more students that wanted to go to college than there were openings. And if you weren't a good student, you weren't getting into college. And I wasn't a good student. One of my friends in my neighborhood had heard about Peru State in junior college and went out, and he came back and he said, there were several of us that were in the neighborhood that wanted to go to college. He said, "One, you can get in. Midwestern colleges have open enrollment." He said, "Two, it's cheaper than going to school at home. And 3, they've got athletic programs." And I wanted to play football. One of my other buddies was a really good cross-country runner. He was the Massachusetts Class A cross-country champion, and nobody back there recruited him. You know, so out we came to Nebraska. And I married a farm girl and never went home again. I even lost my accent. You'll notice I don't park the car in the yard anymore. Have y'all seen the movie Good Will Hunting? That was what my neighborhood was like. Not quite that rough, but close enough. I wasn't in South Boston. I was in Worcester. Worcester, we call it. You call it Worcester. Anyway, I was an art major and got a degree in fine arts and a degree in art ed. I was a high school art teacher, and then I was lucky enough to get on the faculty at Peru State. Right about the time I got on the Peru faculty, I started doing one editorial cartoon a week for a chain of weekly newspapers. Then, shortly after that, the Lincoln Journal, now it's the Journal Star, but the Lincoln Journal would have me do an occasional cartoon for them. And then a couple other papers contacted me. So at one time when I was teaching, I was doing 5 editorial cartoons a week for 4 different papers. So, you know, it was a nice little gig. It wasn't paying great, but I got to thinking that maybe my career as a painter might be taking a back seat to my career as a cartoonist, because I'd always wanted to be a cartoonist. I just didn't think there was any opportunities, so that's why I went into fine arts. And so ultimately in the 80s, the Lincoln Journal hired me away from Peru State, and we moved to Lincoln. And I worked for them for about 9 years, and then one day they cut about a dozen jobs, and mine was one of them. So I've been freelancing ever since. And I tell people, if I can make a living drawing cartoons in Nebraska, I can make a living anywhere. But see, the thing was, I'd always freelanced, and the Lincoln Journal, when I worked for them, didn't have me signed to any kind of an exclusivity contract, so I had continued to freelance. So that when I lost my job at the paper, I immediately started, making the rounds and contacting people and saying, hey, I'm not dead. I'm still out here. Now I'm freelancing. And so the idea that, I could go in and talk to a potential client and they weren't saying, you're who? You're from where? I would say, this is Paul Fell, the cartoonist. And they would go, oh, sure. So that really helped a lot. And I'm still plugging away at it. I do a lot of different things, but in the way of editorial cartooning, my work is nationally syndicated by Artisan Syndicate, as you can see down below my signature. That's an online syndicate in Edmonton, Alberta. That's in Canada. They distribute the work of US and Canadian cartoonists all over North America. And what I do is every day I do an editorial cartoon and I send it off to the syndicate. Then newspapers have accounts with the syndicates, and they can just go online, browse through the cartoons and say, oh, I like that one, I'll use it tomorrow, and then they pay the syndicate according to how big a paper they are. In other words, the Cedar Rapids Gazette would pay less for one of my cartoons than, let's say, the Chicago Tribune. It's all based on their circulation numbers. So I do that, and then I also do a weekly cartoon for the Nebraska Press Association. Governor Heineman is our current governor, and this was done actually probably in January. The governor and the legislature are at odds with each other because he's going out after this term, so he's trying to leave a legacy. Actually, the legacy is give as much as you can to your rich buddies before you get out of office. And the legislature doesn't always do what he wants them to do, so I kind of had a showdown here. I also do a weekly cartoon for the Oklahoma Gazette, which is in Oklahoma City. It's a weekly newspaper. The other paper in town is the Daily Oklahoman, which is way to the right. They always have been very, very, very conservative. The Oklahoma Gazette is off to the left, more of a progressive philosophy. They're as much an entertainment publication as they are a news publication. I've been working for them for about 7 years. It's kind of fun because there are no politics crazier than Oklahoma politics, with the exception of Texas politics. And that's where crazy goes off the charts. They make the Iowa and Nebraska legislators look like choir boys. I mean, it's not a matter of what do I do for a cartoon every week, it's which idea should I do. Because one week they're going to cut all the fine arts funding for the Arts Council. The next week they want to make creationism, they want to kick science education out and put creationism in. The next week they want to, make it legal to discriminate against gays, or, it just goes on and on. It just never ends. It's a lot of fun for a cartoonist. And of course then they have earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, ice storms. Oklahoma has it all. Talk a little bit about where I work. I work at home. When I first freelanced, I had a studio in downtown Lincoln because the first 6 months I was freelancing, I was working at home and it drove me nuts. Mostly I was drinking beer and watching Looney Tunes all day. Seriously. Now, I'm the only adult in Lincoln that can watch Looney Tunes for business purposes. Now, I do. I watch those great classic animated cartoons because I actually learned stuff from them about, body positions and techniques, and you wouldn't think a cartoonist that draws still images could learn from animation, but you can, at least I do. But I needed the ritual of going to work, so I got a studio downtown in Lincoln and had it for about 5 years, and worked out good. And then we bought a different house, and it had this great workspace downstairs, and so I decided I'd, give it a try and see how it went. And, like 16 years later, I still haven't had time to decide if I like it. I guess I do. But this is my drawing table, and next to it, I've got my computer and stuff. In the background, that's my I Love Me wall. A lot of you guys have an I Love Me wall. Where you put the plaque that had perfect attendance at the Kiwanis Club, JC Man of the Year, because they couldn't find anybody else. That's the I Love Me wall. The drawing table I'm particularly proud of. It's an old drawing table that came from the University of Nebraska Engineering Department. And you notice those vertical doors on the side? That's, if you ever took a mechanical drawing class, you know that you would tape your paper onto a drawing board and you would leave it taped on the drawing board at the end of the day. You wouldn't take it off because you wanted everything to be lined up. And so you put your drawing board in those slots, and there's 6, one for each class period, and then on the right-hand side there's 6 drawers for supplies. And I found it in an antique shop and just went crazy because I've been looking for one for ages. So I don't know, maybe when I die, maybe I'll be buried with it. I spent a lot of time there. This is my computer setup. I have an iMac. That thing to the left is a scanner, just your run-of-the-mill, $100 Canon scanner. That's the scanner closed and the scanner open. And this is my light box. You can make your own light box. I happened to buy this one when I worked at the paper, and then it mysteriously went home with me when they fired me. I don't know how that happened. It was just in a box, and I discovered it. Basically, all it is a box with a plexiglass top, and it's got fluorescent tubes inside. And you know how you would, when you were a kid, you'd put things up in the window and trace things? This is a little more civilized version of that. Because I do my sketches, and then I trace them onto good paper to do the inking. And what I'm going to show you now is a couple of things about what I use to draw with, and then kind of how the process goes. I don't use the old dip pens like Ding Darling used. There's all sorts of ballpoint pens and felt tip pens. Those of us over 50 can remember when felt tip pens first came on the scene, which was like about the 60s or thereabouts. And that was the Flair pen, and then the Sharpie pen. And before that you had those big permanent magic markers like the grocery stores used. And then they started making pens. And I'm like a drunk in a liquor store. Anytime I go into an art supply store, I come out with pens. I never come out empty-handed. The one at the top is a Pentel. They call that a fountain Pentel. And it kind of works like a fountain pen. You don't refill it. You throw it away when it's dried up. But the tip kind of reacts like a fountain pen, where it will react to different pressures, giving you wider lines or thinner lines. The second one from the top is a Pitt artist pen, just a fine point pen. The brown one is a Micron fine point pen. I use that for a lot of my shading, hatching and cross hatching. And at the bottom, that's a Uniball Deluxe ballpoint pen. And I discovered this pen, and it's a fine point. You see where it says 005 on the brown Micron pen? That's very fine, and this ballpoint pen is very fine, and it's a permanent ballpoint ink. And back before I got a computer, I was coloring my drawings with markers, and those permanent markers have a solvent in them that if you ink your lines first and then color with the marker, that solvent will loosen up your ink lines and cause them to get muddy. And I discovered that this ballpoint pen, you could use the markers right over the top and it works fine. But I still use that pen a heck of a lot. I used to use a brush. Oh, here's a couple of pencils I use. I still go back and forth between the good old number 2 pencil, but you can buy those nice mechanical pencils with the real fine points on them. And what's nice about them is you don't have to sharpen them. For a while I was drawing with a brush, and I don't have any examples of drawings that were done with brushes. I should have loaded a couple in. But those of you who are comic book fans, most of those drawings in comic books, the inking was done with a brush. Everything from the very fine hatching and cross-hatching to the big gooey black thick areas, that's done with a Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush. They have different sizes, but it's a Winsor & Newton Series 7. It's a sable brush. I used to use a number 0, and the last time I bought one, they cost $16 a piece for a little bitty fine sable brush. But nothing works like sable. But it takes a lot of practice to get used to working with them. But now you can buy brush pens. The one at the bottom is a Pitt brand brush pen. The one in the middle is a Pentel brush pen. And the top one is, that's a Pentel brush pen too, but it's called a Pentel sketch pen. And you put cartridges in it. That's what's at the top, is the cartridge. I order a lot of my brush pens and pens from a website called Jet Pens. It's jetpens.com, because they'll have brush pens and different kinds of pens that you can't get in the US, and they get them from Japan. Because as you know, in Japan, to write, you need a brush, because their writing is calligraphy based. So they have all these really cool brush pens, and they're not very expensive. Okay, when I'm working, I start out with a sketch. People always ask, how do you get your ideas? And I have them in a drawer. There's a great ding drawing in there of the cartoonist trying to get an idea, and his head is like, the top of his head's on a hinge, and he's reaching in, digging around, trying to find an idea. I tell people I have a little cardboard box in the drawer in my drawing table that says ideas, and I just pull one out. Getting the idea can be extremely difficult. Sometimes on news days, there's all kinds of stuff going on. Mind you, I'm drawing for the next day. So sometimes, if I've got this brilliant idea about what's going on in Ukraine, I would have to draw the cartoon today and have it published today for the idea to work. But since I'm drawing today for tomorrow, you have to think ahead. And when I was working for the daily paper, I used to have to show sketches to my editor, which I didn't mind doing because my editor, the editorial page editor, Dick Herman, knew more about Nebraska politics than anybody in the state. And so I could show him 3 sketches, and he would pick the one he liked, and then he would explain to me why the other ones wouldn't work. Sometimes they just wouldn't be timely. He said, yeah, if we could run this cartoon today, it'd be a great idea, but by tomorrow, people will have forgotten about it. Or sometimes he'd remind me that maybe I was painting everybody with a broad brush, and not all these people were guilty of the same crime I was accusing half of the population of. So for a young cartoonist, it was good to have these controls. Showing your sketches to clients, you need to have a very complete sketch. This is the first version of a sketch that I would do just for myself. If I was doing it for a client, it would be a much tighter and much more complete sketch. Why would that be? Well, because my clients, whoever they might be, whether they're newspaper editors or a guy that has a company that wants a character design for his corporate identity, these people are not visual people. So I have to make sure they understand what it is I'm trying to do. On a couple of occasions, I've shown a sketch to a client, gotten his okay, brought the finished work to him, and then he looked at it and said, in effect, hey, wait a minute, that's not a giraffe, it's a rhinoceros. I thought you were going to do a giraffe. Well, that was my fault, because I didn't communicate clearly enough to him. So, this is how I rough the sketch together, And you can see that the big guy jumping into the pool is the student loan interest hike. This was actually about a year ago. I think it was last summer. And that's obviously supposed to be a student there in the pool, and she looks like she's kind of unaware of what's going to happen. Meanwhile, up in the lifeguard chair, Congress is taking a nap. But here's the more refined sketch. Now, when I teach any sort of an art class, drawing or cartooning or illustration, and I've also incidentally taught for a number of years at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, I always harp on my students about the importance of sketches. And I tell them the story of the rhinoceros and the giraffe. And, you know, hopefully some of that gets into their thick little heads. Like Michelle Obama says, when you're that age, you're a knucklehead, which is true, you know, when you think about it. But in these sketches, I work out all of my compositional problems. I decide what goes where, how big the girl in the pool is going to be, how big the guy diving on top of her is going to be, what position he's in. I work all this out in the sketch stage so that once I'm happy with my sketch, I trace it onto my good paper. I use a paper called Bristol board. It's about the thickness of the paper you print a basketball schedule on or a football schedule, you know, the ones you hang in the business places. It's a 2-ply paper, and it has a very smooth surface so I can ink on it. I like that hard surface paper. So then I ink the cartoon. This is the inked version. And now I'm ready to take the cartoon and put color on it, because everything I do now is in color, because all of my, all the publications want full color. How do I get the color on the cartoon? Well, back in the day, I would use markers or watercolors like Ding Darling did, and then you had a fairly complicated process for reproducing color called color separation. Nowadays, I do it on the computer, and it's a relatively easy process. But, here's the big but. Sometimes I get to this point in the cartoon and I change my mind. So sometimes this isn't what you see. This is what you see. I got the whole thing inked and I thought, this doesn't work. So I thought, why shouldn't the student be aware of the horrible thing that's going to happen to her? You know, it's like that moment right before the meteor hits. You know, it's much more effective if she's looking up going, uh-oh, instead of her being blissfully unaware. And then I decided to change the position of the guy, because I thought, this is, you know, at the local pool when the kids are cannonballing each other, they don't come in belly first, they come in butt first or feet first. So this is the final inked version. You can see Congress stayed the same. I decided he didn't need a label, so I got rid of that. The fewer labels you can use, the better. The old-timers, if you look at a lot of the old-timey cartoons from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they label everything. Tree, dog, president, White House. It's just, it's crazy. And this is the color version. Nowadays I color my cartoons on the computer. I put them in my scanner. I scan them into, I use an Apple computer. I scan them into an application called Photoshop, and I can do all the color. And then I can make the cartoon the exact size the client wants it to appear in their publication. So even though the original black and white version is 8 by 10, these color versions I shrink down to about 6 inches wide. And they're at a high enough resolution that a paper can purchase the cartoon and run it bigger or smaller, but the average paper runs a cartoon about 6 inches. Talking about the Des Moines Register for a minute, if you guys remember the glory days of the Des Moines Register when they had an editorial cartoonist, when I came along, Frank Miller was the cartoonist, and of course he never worked in color. He did those wonderful, beautiful little black and white pen and ink drawings, kind of the Ding Darling heritage. You remember back in the day with the swine flu? I remember a great Frank Miller cartoon, and he just had this little John Q. Public guy, and he was standing there, and he was looking eye to eye at this giant hog. And there's snot or something dripping out of the hog, you know, the hog's drool. And the hog, of course, is labeled swine flu. I thought, what a great cartoon, you know, it just says everything right there. But then after Frank retired, they had Brian Duffy for many, many years. And Brian did work in color. Apparently, I think he still does work for a Des Moines TV station. But I remember in the 80s, the editor of the Des Moines Register came to Lincoln and spoke to a journalism group. And they were talking about the Des Moines Register's tradition of running the cartoon on page 1. And that went on, again, some of you remember this, went on for generations. I think Ding's cartoons were on page 1. Many major papers ran their cartoons on page 1. And then, I think in the early 80s, they decided to put the cartoon inside the Register, and then they moved it back to page 1 again, and the editor said, he said, the reason we moved it is because we figured, well, everybody else is putting their cartoons inside, we should too. Well, the readers in Iowa said, nothing doing, we want our cartoon on page 1. So they moved it back. Here's a couple of other cartoons that I just did the other day. I thought I'd throw in here. This has to do with all the changes in our frequent flyer deals. I don't know about you, but I've given up even trying to do the miles and stuff, because if you have miles, you can't redeem them. I had lunch with this bunch of guys, some of whom are retired professors, and a couple of them are still entrepreneurial businessmen. This one guy is a real entrepreneur and very successful. Last month, he flew to Singapore, stayed overnight, and flew home using his miles so that he could get more miles to get to platinum status. I said, okay, John. He said, I'm going to have to live another 65 years to use up all my miles. But this was the rough sketch, and then I was able to trace it. Oh, sometimes what I do too is my sketches are not always the right size, because when I sketch, I'm not thinking about size. I'm just thinking of, you know, how I want to get the idea down on paper. So sometimes I have to scan the sketch into the computer, reduce it or enlarge it to 8 by 10, and then I print it out and trace it onto the good paper. So here's the inked version. Pretty close. One guy saying blankety blank birds, and the other guy saying blankety blank airlines. And here's the color version. Not happy with that fire hydrant in the background. I don't think the perspective's quite right, and I should have made it a little smaller. But hindsight is a wonderful thing. This is one I did last week also. Political candidates. And this I used as one of my national cartoons, because this could apply to Nebraska politics, but it also can apply to politics in any other state, because these are the promises they're making wherever they are. I'll limit abortions, I'll repeal Obamacare, I'll cut taxes. And he says, what do you mean, how? What kind of question is that? And here's the color version. Why the balloons? Well, what are balloons filled with? Hot air. Duh. Let's see what else we have here. These are a couple of cartoons I do for the, I told you I work for the Nebraska Press Association. The way this works is I do a cartoon for them every week, and they distribute it to their member newspapers all over the state of Nebraska. And it accompanies a column called Capitol View. And the guy that writes the column is a longtime acquaintance of mine, and he tries to send me the column early in the week so I can read it and think about it. And I try to do a cartoon that goes with the column. To put this in context, It says, as 2014 legislative session opens, opponents of Senator Ernie Chambers resume attempts to outsmart him. Senator Ernie Chambers is Nebraska's longtime serving senator. He is one of two, maybe he's the only black state legislator in our whole legislature. He's about 20 times smarter than the other doofuses, and they've always got these schemes where they're going to outsmart him. And it's always amazing for me to watch these guys try to outthink the thinker. He knows more about, you know, legislative processes than anybody, and it's just really funny to watch him try to outmaneuver Ernie. You can see this year they got it figured out. They're going to paint a big X on the ground, and then he walks on top of the X. They're going to roll the boulder off the cliff, kind of like the Roadrunner and Coyote. And the guy's there, ready down here, let's try her out. Don't forget to move. Now they're talking about charter schools in our legislature. And I'm a former veteran public school teacher. I'm not real sold on the idea of charter schools. Basically, it takes money away from the public schools, who of course have so much money to work with. It's obscene. Let's run education like a business, shall we? Jeez. Don't ask the teachers. Anyway, the Nebraska legislature seems to be skipping along behind the Piper. And property tax relief. Everybody wants property tax relief. There's an old saying from the Revolutionary War times that says, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the man behind the tree. You know, we all want services, but we don't want to pay taxes. Trouble is, sometimes you get more than what you wish for, and some of these property tax relief schemes that they're talking about are going to have some unforeseen consequences. Like, for instance, if you reduce property taxes, that means that's that much less income coming into the state to support state services. Which services would you like to be cut in exchange for reduced property taxes or reduced taxes in general? Well, not my services, your services. Tax the man behind the tree. Here's a couple cartoons I did for the Oklahoma Gazette. At 7 a.m., my mom called the superintendent's office to say it was too cold to send kids to school. Gosh, I think it was like 28 in Oklahoma City. Ooh. At 10 a.m., she sent us out to play because we were driving her nuts. I mean, you guys get that here. Big, you know, the school administrators are running scared all the time because if they call a snow day or a cold day, they catch hell from half the parents. If they don't call off school, they catch hell from the other half. So they call off the day because of excessive snow and cold. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the kids are all out rolling in the snow, but they can't wait for the school bus. I taught my first year out of college, I taught in Michigan. And we weren't in the Upper Peninsula, but we were almost in the Upper Peninsula, you know, up by the Mackinac Bridge, where they get all that lake effect snow. And I remember the first month or so of teaching, I was asking some people, you know, who were natives. I said, how many snow days do you guys get up here? And the guy looked at me and said, snow days? What the hell are snow days? I said, you know, when school's called off. He said, we don't call off school up here. And we lived just outside of town. The town was on this big lake. And we had a picnic table out in our backyard. And, you know, I'd look out the window in the morning and say, ooh, we got another 9 inches of snow today. Hey, Arlene, snow day today. Just then I hear the plow go by. Ah, geez, we got to go to school again. They said it was a really mild football season. I was an assistant football coach. We only played one game in the snow. They said this is really unusual. We usually play 3 games in the snow. Jeez. Here they raised the gift limit this year in the Oklahoma legislature so that lobbyists used to only be able to give the equivalent of $100 a session to each senator, like for meals and drinks and things like that. Now they've raised the limit to $500. And I thought, boy, that'll get the dog to dance. This is just one I did last week. I don't know if you follow a lot of the people in Washington, D.C., but Senator Tom Coburn is one of the Oklahoma State senators. Pretty conservative guy, he's a physician. He came out with the announcement that if you've been reading the media and listening to the gun guys for the last, well, ever since Obama became president, it's that the government's buying up all the ammunition. Obama's ordering them to buy up all the ammunition. And that way we won't have any ammunition to defend our families. Well, Coburn came out and said, we've investigated all this. There's not a bit of truth to it. As a matter of fact, since the second term of President Obama, Homeland Security has bought less ammunition than they did under the Bush administration. So now the gun guys are really upset at Coburn. So here he says, well, if the government's not buying up all the ammo, driving up prices and causing shortages, then who is? And she says, you are, you nitwit. Here's a few more artisans' cartoons. When the Arizona anti-gay law went down in flames, bigotry, intolerance, and hate were wondering if they were going to be out of business. Well, of course you're not. You're recession-proof. There's always somebody to discriminate against. You just cross out that name and you put a new one in. You know, it used to be blacks, then it was Mexicans, then it was gays. You know, there'll be some other group you can pick up. And the minimum wage. The little waitress tells the guy, do you realize how silly you look? I don't know if people are aware of this. It's probably the same in Iowa. Waiters and waitresses in Nebraska make $2.38 an hour. That's all the restaurants pay them. That's all they're required to pay them. They're supposed to make the rest up by tips. So some girl waits on a table of 8 people. The bill comes to $300. They leave her 10. I know I was talking to a guy that I know is a partner in a bar, and he said some nights those girls in the bar come home the end of the night, you know, an 8-hour shift with $35. You know, that's just ridiculous. I went crazy with color here, so I'll have to read this to you. It'll be below zero Monday, 70 and Sunday on Tuesday, with rain and ice storms Wednesday. There's a tornado watch on Thursday with blizzard warnings for Friday. I can't take it anymore! And the guy says, looks like we'll be getting a new television meteorologist pretty soon. That's meanwhile out on the Great Plains. Of course, we get different weather in southeast Nebraska than you guys do here in Iowa City. You guys just get winter. You know, like all those big snowstorms that come through Kansas City and, you know, north central Missouri and up through Des Moines, then you get it. And a lot of that stuff misses us. We are really dry in Nebraska. You know, and now they're finding that the aquifer is dropping. So they're having to start talking about putting controls on irrigation. You know, you get to Iowa and Illinois, it's really hard to find a center pivot irrigation thing because, you know, most of the time it rains at the right time. As I said, most of the time, until you buy a farm. I married into a farm family. I'm a city kid. I grew up near Boston, as I said. My father worked for the city at the city auditorium. They always had a big home show. And for my sister and me, the high point at the home show was Hillcrest Dairy would always have a big, you know, display at the home show. And they would bring in a couple of their prize golden Guernsey cows. We got to go see the cows. Wow. Dad, can I go see the cow? I just took you Tuesday. Oh, come on, Dad. And I, you know, go out to this farm family. My wife's family had 9 kids, you know, 7 girls and 2 boys. And I don't know why it was. Well, I know why it was, but they would never let me drive any equipment. I was always the one that was either pushing something, pulling something, or carrying something. And, you know, I didn't know how to do anything else, being a city kid. And when the girls got kind of bored, they would get together and they would say, let's talk Paul into going out and getting on that old tractor and backing up a trailer. Say, hey Paul, can you get on that old case tractor and back that manure spreader into the shed? Oh yeah, I can do that. I'd be out there for 90 minutes cussing and screaming, and they're in the house just having a party. Never did master that. This cartoon's called Game Over. I did this actually before Putin sent his friends into Crimea. It was pretty close. You know, and what are we going to do about it? 2 weeks ago, the Republicans were talking about how Obama was overbearing and not consulting Congress and taking all this, like a dictator, doing all this stuff without, it's illegal. And now they're going, he's not doing enough, he's not doing enough. You know, what are we going to do? There's nothing we can do. I was watching MSNBC last night, and there was a journalist on whose beat was Russia, and she said Crimea's gone. In terms of, it's no longer going to be part of Ukraine, it's going to be part of Russia. It's done. What are you going to do? Have sanctions? Okay. That's not going to do anything either. I mean, he's doing whatever he wants to do. Certainly we don't want a world war. Here we go. The announcer says, America's dependence on foreign oil continues to diminish as gas prices are now at a low of 19 cents a gallon. In other news, pure drinking water hit an all-time high today of $3.95 a gallon. And they want to run a pipeline through Nebraska. They had saw a great cartoon from Jim Moran of the Miami Herald in our local paper the other day, and it showed the route of this. He would okay the pipeline. Moran would be happy with it if they changed the route. And the route went through Senator McConnell's house, Senator Cruz's place, you know, all these conservative senators and congressmen that are so excited about the pipeline. Well, route it through your place then. I'll let you ponder on this one for a couple of minutes. The middle class is being erased by the income gap, and the GOP is being threatened by irrelevance. You know, back in the early 70s, my wife and I we started traveling to other countries, and I said, geez, you know, we go to these other countries, there's no middle class. There's either the haves or the have-nots. I'm sure glad it isn't like that in America. You know, it's scary. Think about this stuff. Okay, a couple of things I wanted to mention, just for your edification. If you want to see editorial cartoons, you used to have to be a freak like me and go haunt public libraries and look at newspapers from all over the country. And now it's really easy. I can give you a couple of websites, and they should stick in your memory. One is artisans.com, my syndicate, and you can go and browse through all their cartoons. They sell more than political cartoons. They sell illustrations, caricatures, gag cartoons, and it's really fun to just see what's there every day. You can also go to editorialcartoonists.com. And that's the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, and a lot of us post our cartoons there every day. Again, they're both free sites, which is great. Or you can go to my website, which is paulfellcartoons.com, and I have another thing I do, which I haven't mentioned. I have a free cartoon and news service called the Daily Felltoon. And if you go to my website, you can click on the link that says Daily Felltoon, and there'll be a little box that you can click on, and you can sign up to get your Daily Felltoon every business day for free, and it'll come to you as an email, and it has a whole bunch of news links. People love the news links. My web guy does this for a talk radio show anyway. And what they are is headlines. So instead of you having to go to all these sites and look through to try to find, something that interests you, you just see the headline on the Daily Feldtoon, click on it, and it takes you right to that publication. And then we also have an editorial every day and my daily cartoon. And again, it's free, you can't beat the price. I briefly wanted to touch, before I go, on the state of editorial cartooning today. Back when Ding Darling was a cartoonist, every paper in America, it seemed like, had a cartoonist. Now, they all drew alike, because nobody could see what the other papers were doing, because we didn't have the means of communication we do today. But in the 1970s, late 70s, I joined the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists. I was a freelancer then, before I went full-time with the paper. But there were 300 full-time editorial cartoonists in the US and Canada. 300, staff members. Today there are about 36 left. Newspapers have been cutting them for years. A lot of it has to do with economics. I mean, you can buy a syndicated cartoon for $10. Why pay a guy $50,000 a year? The thing they miss, though, is the syndicated cartoons aren't about what's going on in town. They're not about what's going on in the legislature. They're about stuff that nobody's going to write to the editor about. Are you going to write a letter about Crimea? Probably not. Would you write a letter about widening Main Street? Probably so. So it's a lot of it is economics. It's sad. Des Moines Register had Brian Duffy. He's gone. Kansas City has Lee Judge, who's part-time, took a buyout, so Kansas and Missouri do not have an editorial cartoonist. St. Louis used to have R.J. Matson, but they cut him a couple years ago. The Omaha World Herald, bless their conservative hearts, has Jeff Katurba, and he's been with them about 20 years. And they've had some big cuts at that paper, and they've kept him, so that's to their credit. Denver no longer has editorial cartoonists. They all use syndicated stuff. And I don't know where it's going to go. I do know it's really tough making a living as a freelancer. You have to be really diversified. In addition to my editorial cartoons, I do all kinds of other humorous illustration stuff, which I like. I like the variety of challenges. It'd be fine to just get paid for doing one cartoon a day, but I can't imagine doing that. I'm sometimes doing 4 and 5 things a day, and that's fine with me. So I don't know where editorial cartooning is going, but mostly what you see anymore is syndicated stuff that your paper buys for a few bucks, and the cartoons don't mean as much as when Frank Miller and Ding Darling and Brian Duffy were doing cartoons about the Iowa legislature and conservation in Iowa and taxes in Iowa. They just don't. And it's sad, but that's and newspapers will never die, but they're diminishing too. So used to be every city worth its salt had at least 2 papers, and that's a long gone deal. So I don't know the answers. But that leaves me with questions. Do we have any questions that I can answer for you guys? Or make up answers? Yes, back there in the center.
I can understand what your political persuasion is from this talk.
No.
Yes, and I personally agree with you 100%, but I know there's a whole bunch of people that don't. And I guess I wondered especially how you mentioned that you sell to one Oklahoma publication that's very conservative.
I sell to the one that's progressive.
Okay, so that's kind of my question.
Yeah.
Conservative publications would not buy from you for political reasons.
But there are a good number of conservative cartoonists. Like if you went to the Daily Oklahoman, they haven't had a full-time cartoonist for quite a few years, but they buy the work of a number of people that I know, like Michael Ramirez and Gary Varvel and Steve Breen, and those guys tend to lean more to the right. When newspapers all had staff cartoonists, the cartoonists didn't do what the newspaper told them what to do. Some people were under the idea that the newspaper gave the cartoonist the idea and he would draw whatever the paper told him to draw. Well, in fact, the cartoonist came up with the idea, just like your local columnists would come up with ideas for their columns. That's why their names, their bylines are on the column, because it's their column. But it would have to pass muster with the paper. And if you were, you know, way, way liberal and your paper was way, way conservative, probably that marriage wouldn't last. You know, you had to find some sort of happy medium. I probably would not be happy at the Omaha World Herald, because they tend to be more Republican than I am. Jeff Katerba is very happy. They're very happy with Jeff. It works great, you know.
Just a quick follow-up. I can tell you're really passionate about what you believe, and I respect that. So I guess I wanted to ask, when you're doing these cartoons, is that partly because you feel so passionate about the issues? I mean, is that really a big part of your motivation?
Yeah, you have to. You know, it's just some things get your attention, you know, get you fired up. But again, you know, you have to be kind of careful. If you're passionate about some subject, you go, geez, I've done 3 cartoons about the pipeline this month. You know, it's a little overkill here. There's lots of other people to pick on who are just as deserving. And the other thing I think a cartoonist has to be willing to do is go after the guys on your side. You know, when Ben Nelson was governor of Nebraska, he was a Democrat. Bob Kerrey was a Democrat. I was more than happy to do cartoons about those guys when they slipped up, because you have to be willing to do that. Your job, as I tell somebody, it's like being the little boy in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. My job is to not say, wow, what a cool outfit. My job is to say, hey, wait a minute, he doesn't have any pants on. And sometimes that's your guy, you know, which is fine. But what's really kind of weird is you do this cartoon, really skewering a local politician, and then 2 days later you get a phone call. This is Senator so-and-so's office. He was wondering if there's any way he could get the original. What happened was he looked at the cartoon and goes, oh, that dirty SOB, blah, 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 and then his phone started ringing. And they say, hey, Georgie, saw you in the paper today. Saw you in the paper. And pretty soon he's going, yeah, I was in the paper today. So it's kind of funny how that works. When Ben Nelson was the governor of Nebraska, his office would always call and they wanted, you know, the original. And I would say, well, I sell my originals for X amount of dollars. And they would say, okay, we'll talk to the governor and we'll get back to you. They never call back. And I told people, Ben Nelson didn't get to be a wealthy man by buying cartoon originals. Now, when he became a U.S. Senator, I would get calls for originals, and I knew his press guy, and I would say, hey, Jim, you know, this is a paying deal. I know how cheap your boss is. He says, don't worry, we got to check. So that worked okay. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned being a teacher.
Yes.
I wonder if you have any students who have either gone into cartooning or become artists or designers.
Yeah, I do.
That must be
It's kind of in spite of all my efforts.
right.
Yeah, when I taught at Peru State College, I had a little gal named Desiree Klein. She was from Southwest Iowa, and she was a volleyball player and a javelin thrower, of all things. And she loved cartooning, and she loved wildlife art. And she became a high school art teacher up in the Nebraska Sandhills. I don't know if you've ever been in the Sandhills, but it's Nebraska's ranch country. And, you know, they're all cowboys up there. And she's trying to teach, you know, still life painting to a bunch of young cowboys. And she said she noticed that they all had pocket knives, you know, in the holder on their belt. And so she figured out maybe she'd get them involved in wood carving. And then she got interested in it. And the last 25 years, she's become one of the leading wood carving artists in America. Wildlife, I mean, she sells her pieces for thousands of dollars. Her husband, Bernie, was a special ed teacher. She quit teaching to pursue the carving thing, and they travel all over the country doing workshops and shows. He had to quit teaching so he could become her manager. So that's been pretty cool. I had a young guy out at the University of Nebraska, Kearney, who was a all-conference football player, he was a center, so he and I could talk shop because I was a center in college too. And he loved cartooning and he could draw like crazy. Well, he got a degree in graphic design, but he really wanted to be an animator. And he worked in Kearney for a couple of years at Morris Press, and he was from Chicago and moved back to Chicago, and now he's a lead designer with one of the big video game companies up there, designing characters for video games. The third guy that comes to mind, I don't know what he's doing right now, but his name was Ryan Quincy, and he was getting ready to graduate, and he was taking independent study from me in cartooning at UNK, and he said, I think I'm going to go to LA and try to break into animation. And I said, well, you know, you're single, you don't have a girlfriend, you don't have any children. I said, the day's going to come fairly soon when you're going to have a family and maybe you won't be able to do that. I said, why not go take a chance? What do you got to lose? Because you don't want to go through your life saying, what if, what if, what if? So he goes out to LA. Have you seen South Park on the cartoon channel? I'm not a big fan of South Park, but they were just doing South Park the movie. He got on with the animation crew for South Park the movie. When they finished with the movie, they cut a whole bunch of people's jobs, kept him on with the TV show, and he became chief animator for South Park. So that's pretty cool. You know, and here I am still trying to freelance. They never call, they never write, but it is kind of cool. At UNK, I worked a lot with the graphic design students, and it's really interesting to see those kids, which graphic design is the modern term for commercial art, but it's become so much more sophisticated and technical, and it's really interesting to see some of those kids that I had back in the 90s, you know, and they've become successful owners of design studios around the country and doing incredible stuff. Way over my head, boy. Geez, I'm still just drawing pictures. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I worked at the Milwaukee Sentinel for many years, and we had a couple of cartoonists up there, Bill Sanders with the Milwaukee Journal and Stu Carlson with the Sentinel.
Yep.
I was wondering if you
Knew them
had any
both.
comments on them.
Knew them both. I knew Bill better than Stewart. I still see Stewart's work around. Bill retired and moved to Florida. He's still doing cartoons now and again, mostly playing Dixieland music. But he's one of the all-time characters. But the cartooning business is great because, you know, if you're like me, you belong to the Editorial Cartoonist Association, and I belong to the National Cartoonist Society, which means if I haven't met everybody in the business, I know of them. So I can say, yeah, I know who she is, I know who he is, and it's a wonderful group of people. Very few jackasses in the cartooning business, because most of them made it on their own. Now there's a couple that took over their father's feature. Jeff Keane is doing Family Circus, but he's helping his dad Bill for 20 years. The Walker boys have been helping their dad Mort on Beetle Bailey for years. Trying to think of who else. Chris Brown from just over in Sioux Falls took over Hager the Horrible from his dad Dick Brown when Dick got sick. But Chris was a well-established cartoonist before that. But most everybody else, you know, made it on their own, and I think they keep pinching themselves going, boy, I'm so lucky to get paid for what I used to get kicked out of class for doing. And then you think to yourself, you know, this could all end tomorrow. You know, I could lose my vision or my... case in point, Charles Schultz had to quit drawing Peanuts because he'd had some surgery and had a stroke on the operating table, and it affected his vision. Strangely enough, the day he died was the last Peanuts strip. That's when the last strip appeared that he drew. Everything since then has been reruns. So, but it's kind of neat to get together with those people because, you know, whether we're 90, because there's some old cartoonists that, well, I'm getting kind of long in the tooth, you know, I'm 68. But there's guys like Mort Walker that just turned 90, still working. Brad Anderson that does Marmaduke is at least 90. He's still working. I tell people there's no retired cartoonists, there's just old cartoonists. But we're just kids, you know? And we all get together and we're all talking shop and having a great time, whether it's the young ones or the old ones. So it's a fun profession in that regard, and I've made a lot of great friends because of that. Wiley Miller, that draws non sequitur, lived here in Iowa City for a long time. I don't know if you guys were aware of that. His wife was accepted at the Writers' Workshop, and that's why they moved to Iowa City. Lived just north of the interstate a little ways. He hated the weather, hated it. So when the girls graduated from high school, they moved back to California. They lived there for about 4 or 5 years. Then one day, because he and I are very close, called me up one day and he says, well, we're moving again. I said, really? Where are you moving to? Kennebunkport, Maine. I said, Wiley, do you realize that they have S-N-O-W in Kennebunkport? Well, they would summer up there because his wife's brother lived there, so they're still up there. But, you know, up there makes Iowa City look like the tropics. Okay, any more questions? Anybody got any answers? Have you learned anything? Yes. I'm sorry. Okay, seriously, thank you very much. And Tom, thank you for